Thanks for everyone for tuning in to another episode of the Bully Resistance Show. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that there's two ways that you can actually help me continue the fight against bullying in the public schools. First, if you haven't subscribed to the Bully Resistance Show, it doesn't cost you anything. All you have to do is just go to my website at www.davebond.org, and you'll see the banner and that says subscribe, and all you have to do is just click on that. The second way that you can help, you can be a monthly sponsor as low as $4 per month, and in return, you're going to get a free weekly digital download of a track of mine or a song of mine from the CDs that I have out, and also a monthly digital download CD. Now this way, you're not just giving money away, but you're getting something in return. So all you have to do is just go to my website at www.davebond.org, scroll down and click on the Patreon banner, and it's going to take you to get you or to give you some more information about that. So with no further ado, sit back and enjoy the next Bully Resistance Show. The Bully Resistance Show is brought to you by Parkersburg Jiu-Jitsu, a Pedro Sauer affiliate located in Vienna, West Virginia. Go to parkersburgbjj.com, or you can call 740-591-2706. And if you mention the Bully Resistance Show, you're going to receive 2 free weeks of training in self-defense and also a private lesson from one of our instructors. Restrictions do apply. The Bully Resistance Show is brought to you by Planet Fitness, located in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and Marietta, Ohio. They strive to create a workout environment where everyone feels accepted and respected. That's why at Planet Fitness in Parkersburg and Marietta, they take care to make sure their club is clean and welcoming. Their staff is friendly. There's certified trainers. Everything's there. So whether you're a first-time gym user or a fitness veteran, you'll always have a home in their judgment-free zone.
Welcome, everyone, to the Bully Resistance Show with David Wells, nationally known smooth jazz artist, CEO and co-founder of the Chocolate Jazz Foundation, and the co-host of a 2-hour syndicated radio program called Chocolate Jazz Radio. Bully Resistance is a weekly 1-hour show that's a motivational, informative, and inspirational program. We will have interviews with musicians, actors, government officials, politicians, psychologists, counselors, and just average day citizens. Of course, the topics will include making right choices, never giving up desire, discipline, determination, bullying in public schools, the workplace, and in your community, bully resistance and prevention, self-defense, jiu-jitsu, and current affairs, and much, much more. And if you're ready, we are. Here's your host, David Wells.
I want to thank everyone for tuning in to another episode of the Bully Resistance Show. My name is David, and today we have a special guest from Brooklyn, New York. Is that correct, Jess?
Yeah.
Okay. Also, she is the founder and CEO of I'll Go First and the podcast creator and host of I'll Go First. She's also a speaker and a consultant on mental health. And before she got involved with I'll Go First, she was actually had a lot of background experience in anti-human trafficking, which we'll go ahead and discuss later in the program. So at this time, I want to introduce Jessica Minhas on the Bully Resistance Show. Jessica, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh my gosh, I'm so honored. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. Now, you pronounce your last name Minhas? Is that correct?
You know, it's so funny. I didn't grow up with my biological father, so I actually pronounced it Minhas for like most of my life until I found my family. Okay. It's Minhas. So Minhas. Yeah, close.
Okay. Now, can I call you Jess?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Hey, before we go any further, can you just give the listeners a little bit more background about where you were born and raised, your education, and a few of your accomplishments? Sorry.
That's such a funny question to answer. I think it's so different for everybody, for each one of us, to try and summarize. It's harder for me because I grew up in a military family, So saying where I'm from kind of, encompasses a lot of different places. But I was born in Germany, and then I was raised by my mom's parents. So they were retired by then, so they bounced around as well. So I guess kind of in Germany, and then I was raised in Wisconsin some, and then in Florida, so kind of all over the place.
Okay, and so when did you move to New York? Or now you live in Brooklyn?
Yeah, I moved to New York right after I graduated from university because I was searching for my biological family. So that was 15 years ago.
Okay, and then tell me a little bit about your education background.
I love school. So I went to university in Florida. I sped through college as quickly as possible because I was really motivated to try and get up to New York and find this biological family that I had been searching for. And then I thought if I was on TV, then I might have a better chance of locating them. So I went to an acting conservatory for 3 years, William Esper Studios, which was really neat. It was really healing. And then I went back for journalism at NYU, and then I went back to the Seattle School for Theology and Psychology for narrative therapy and trauma counseling, and then I just finished a program at Harvard Medical School on global mental health and trauma and refugee recovery.
Okay, when I was preparing for the show, I was amazed with your different accomplishments, and especially with your education background. And that being said, what actually made you want to pursue an education at Harvard, especially, I guess, in the trauma and recovery program?
Something that you and I talked about over email is just this struggle of trying to find worth and esteem and confidence. And I think Harvard is obviously an amazing university, and they're the only ones really that offer a program in global mental health. But I think as a kid growing up without parents and growing up in an abusive household, going to an Ivy League school for better or for worse was like a eye on the prize goal of mine. So I'm glad and I'm just honored to get accepted. But I think it's just taking time to realize, those names are just names, and really it's about the educational content you get. So I'm truly honored to have gone into the program, like I said. But I think largely it was motivated by also wanting to check off this box, if I'm being completely transparent.
Right. I have to say this, in the last few weeks, I've been trying to avoid talking about the coronavirus on the podcast. And I guess one of the main reasons was because I just didn't want to date the shows, and because I might want to use them later on down the road. And so this is the first time I've actually shared this since the coronavirus. A lot of my listeners know me that I've been a full-time musician for 20 years, and for the first time, within a day or two, all my speaking engagements, all my performances were canceled. And
wow.
So I've actually been unemployed for over 4 weeks now. And the most difficult part of this whole coronavirus is when I would actually wake up in the morning, every morning, realizing, okay, is this a dream or is this reality? Because I really, it just seemed like every morning, okay, this is another day of being unemployed. This is another day dealing with, the coronavirus and being isolated and everything else. That being said, I guess what's been one of the most difficult things for you to deal with the coronavirus, and especially living in New York?
I think that the pressure it puts on relationships are just different. I think that New York we're driven by ambition. You come here to New York, you are a special breed of person. Unless you've been raised here, then you're also a different breed of person. But if you've moved here, you have a drive, you have an ambition, you have a grit. And, we're like overproductive, I guess, is one way to say it. We pack our schedules in. So this coronavirus here in the city, everything being stopped, it's almost like a level of like low level depression has set in. And I think also, we live in smaller houses and apartments, and so we're suddenly with our family members or friends in very confined spaces for very, very long time. So I've noticed the most about dynamics in my friendships have changed a little bit. And also, you're speaking about work. That's been a big worry for a lot of people in my community, because a lot of us are entrepreneurs, and if we work overseas in human rights zones, that's another pressure. A friend of mine is working with trafficking victims in India, with the complete lockdown in India, we're seeing all these other fallout components, famine and all of that. So I think it's just trying to deal with all those pressures, and then we can't relate to one another. We can't, come together and kind of process. So I think that's the biggest part, is just the uncertainty, and then the kind of the emotional pressure that we acknowledge or we don't acknowledge. And, it's really, Governor Cuomo talks a lot about this in his press conferences, that whether we like it or not, this is affecting us. So he's actually given him, it's been really remarkable to see the resources that have come together, and they have a free mental health hotline that is available to New Yorkers, but obviously it's toll free, so it's nationwide. If anyone wants to call it, they can.
Right. I think it was, Jess, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, because I've been following Governor Cuomo and his news briefings, and I think he's doing an awesome job just keeping everybody updated. But I think at the time there was, close to 200,000 cases in New York State, and almost, I think, 10,000 deaths now. Is that correct? Or does that sound
as
close?
Of this morning, it's almost 1,100. I think for the city of New York, I want to say we're inching up to 7,000 people here in New York City.
Okay, so let me ask you this: in regards to how people are dealing with all this emotionally, and I know that you're familiar with September 11th. How does September 11th compare to coronavirus emotionally towards people, or what's your opinion on that?
That's been an interesting question that's kind of been floating around all of our minds, and I love that you asked that. I think for me, my perspective on it is that September 11th was an external pressure and an external event. This virus is an internal event, and it's silent and we can't see it. And just like, for example, a chronic illness, it's almost harder to cope with because you can't look at a broken arm and be like, okay, this is the progress I'm making. The virus is just a silent virus. And I think the added pressure too is that it's, someone who's asymptomatic can be contagious. So I think that it's just like it's in the air, we're just completely on edge. When September 11th happened, it was a isolated, terrifying event, and there was a fallout of mourning and just a different type of terror. This one is just like a low level of high stress consistently. I've actually had, I remember 3 days ago, I was just scrolling through Facebook, and I probably for a good half an hour was just writing condolences on people's posts. So many people have had family members, and I actually just recently found the rest of my biological family who had moved from India to Queens a few months back, and I was in touch with them. And one of my cousin's moms, who's related by marriage, she passed a few days ago from coronavirus, and so that was really humbling. I wasn't close with them, but just the concept that everyone's really being touched by the virus.
Oh, I can't imagine. I think New York City, it's just a place that nobody wants to live there now. I mean, just because the fear and everything else that people are going through. I think I was reading an article online, and it said something. It says, let me see. Nearly half the people in the United States feel that the coronavirus crisis is harming their mental health. According to a survey published, I think it was like last Thursday, it demonstrates how the COVID-19 pandemic has escalated into a nationwide psychological trauma. If you read all the polls, there's one thing that's clear. If you're scared, and I'm talking to the listeners, if you're scared, if you're anxious, depressed, struggling to sleep through the night, or just on edge, you're not alone. I would think that probably 99% of the population is going through the same thing. That being said, what advice or hope can you give to people to help better cope with all this, about all these uncertainties with the pandemic?
When we talk about trauma, something that often comes up is the inability to articulate and frame what's going on. So I think that because we're not able to communicate with each other or see each other face to face and be comforted by one another, and really that physical touch, physical touch is so helpful to regulate our nervous systems when we've experienced trauma.
Right.
Honestly, like journaling is really big right now. I think for listeners out there, if you can sit with yourself and journal, that will really help regulate and calm yourself. And also, it will help you see over time how far you've come, and that really validate your experience to say, yes, this was really bad. Like, this wasn't just something I was coping with. My feelings were not that big of a deal. No, this was really serious, and this really affected us. And something someone said to me recently, and Cuomo says this a lot in his press conferences, but a friend of mine was saying this: we have to remember that none of us have ever coped with this before. So it's all new. So I would say journaling.
Right.
I know it's really hard to do meditation and trauma counseling. We often talk about meditation as something. So whether that's prayer or meditation, sitting and being calm with yourself is another thing that is really helpful on a neurological and physiological level. And I think as much as you can, talking with friends over Skype is really helpful, or video conferences.
Right. Now, have you been able to go out personally outside and walk and exercise? Or are they real strict?
Gosh, it has been an interesting process. We actually, my husband and I live around the corner from a hospital, so that's been really humbling as well, because we almost every 3 days see an increase of the temporary morgues outside of the hospital. So our area is really kind of quieted down. I think everyone's especially nervous because we're by the hospital. But so we do go running here and there, going to the grocery store with our masks and our gloves. Just going somewhere with purpose is really exciting.
Right.
So he and I look forward to going to the bodega every day to just get like an apple as like a purposeful thing to leave the house.
Yeah.
So we are permitted to, but it's very, everyone's just really on edge with everything.
I think, you know what, one of the things that has been helping me, I got into it in a different routine. I would still wake up, and my office is a separate building from the house. And so me coming to my office sort of makes me feel like everything's normal. You know, now if I have to sit in the house and do nothing, I probably would react totally different. But I work out. The family has been walking together. I mean, my wife and I, and then my son. He's on like 11 different medications, and he has major lung issues, and so we are so nervous about who comes around. But I think what helps me a lot is, I think, the exercising, walking, and then I've been going out before this all started. I was working out with weights, but then I'm developing new programs like this body weight workouts. And, so that's helping me. But anyway, enough about that. Let me ask you this. When I initially set up this interview, I was doing a lot of research. I was watching a lot of videos of you speaking and everything else. And I was taken by how you were raised, and by your grandparents. Can you share your story about being raised by your grandparents a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the hardest part about that story is the confusion around it all. And I would say to anyone listening, I wonder if they would empathize with this. Just if you're raised in a household with addiction and mental illness and alcoholism, the whole experience is really chaotic and unnerving. So the story really begins with my mother. She had my identical twin sister and I in Germany, and my father is from India, but she was not able to care for my identical twin Jennifer and I, so her parents, my grandparents, took over care. Okay. But they were World War II veterans in their own respects. My grandmother was the daughter of a German soldier, and my grandfather was a U.S. GI, and they sort of, I say, kind of collided into each other during the war because they both had so much trauma that really affected their ability to interact with each other, and the way that they really coped with it was a lot of alcohol. So by the time they took over custody of my twin and I, they were, nightly drinking, and their relationship really devolved into serious domestic violence. My grandmother had multiple bones that had been broken. It was just kind of a normal thing that she was consistently in a cast of some sort. Of course, the alcohol didn't help her health in terms of like her she was just frail. And then my identical twin sister and I were involved in a fatal accident where she was killed. The accident was completely avoidable, which is something I think I'm just learning to cope with and process now in my own counseling journey. But it was that my grandparents were drinking in a different part of the building, and they had left my twin and I to take a nap, and we had gotten out, and then the accident happened where we were climbing on a piece of a kitchen appliance and it fell down. My grandparents didn't come. They didn't realize what happened because they just weren't in the same room. So by the time they came back, she had suffocated, unfortunately. But like I said, that accident was just, I think of it and it was just dumb. You know, it didn't have to happen. If there had been, if the drinking wasn't involved, it didn't have to happen.
Sure.
So my grandmother really blamed herself for that accident, and so she died from alcoholism, organ failure just a few years later. And then it was just my grandfather and I think he was a very sweet man, I hear, when he wasn't drinking, but I never got to meet that version of him because by the time I got home from school or on the weekends, he was already drunk. And that drunk version of him was very, very mean. And so I think, we talked a little bit earlier about this drive to overachieve, and I think that really comes from trying to want to be loved by my grandfather and want to feel like I wasn't everything that he called me out of his, drunkenness.
Sure.
So he was definitely emotionally abusive. He definitely, was physically slapped me around. He slapped me around a lot. He was never sexually abusive, and I just want to make that clear because I sometimes get asked that.
Sure.
But I think he was maybe even so worried that might be the perception, that he was never he never gave me a hug or anything. So then he really resented having to take care of me. And by the time when I was 15, he drank himself into a stroke, basically, and that half paralyzed him. And then I was responsible, to the best of my ability as a 15-year-old, to try and care for him. But he was so ugly and so mean that it was really hard for me to strike a balance with that. And then about, I think a year and a half later, or not even a year later, he broke his hip, and then he was really resentful. And I think, maybe listeners, again, can empathize with this, but if you've had a family member in there who are older and they've had multiple, they have a stroke or they break a bone, it's they lose the desire to keep going because it's just so hard, I think. And that really was his story. He just really gave up. He just didn't want to be alive. And he lasted about 1 year. And then right after I turned 18, he passed away. And so that was really when I decided to search for my family because I didn't have any family left. And that really brings us back to moving to New York.
Let me ask you this. So, when you are being treated, mistreated, emotionally or verbally or whatever the case, it's bad either way. What made you want to stay around, or what? I guess what made you want to stay around? I mean, you could have easily just left. Was it because you knew deep down that this guy he's a good guy? He's taking care of me. I mean, why did you stay around?
I felt bad for him. I looked at him. He was just so pitiful. It really broke my heart to see him.
Okay.
And also there was that sense of family obligation. I was just talking with a friend of mine this morning whose fiance passed, and she was saying that if he, in some ways it's been really difficult for her, but if he was still around, she'd have given up her career. Absolutely.
Right.
And I feel the same way, just like that family obligation. And I loved him. I always wanted I didn't want him to suffer. And so I think, that's another part of that dynamic of growing up in that sort of household. You're always trying to problem solve, why is this person so miserable? I must be the problem.
Right.
So I must be able to fix it. But I just couldn't bring myself to leave him. And I think looking back, it's been something I've been processing in counseling even now, is that duality of, having the opportunity for scholarship or having the opportunity to leave and to move, but feeling like I can't leave this man just to die on his own. And now looking back, should I have? I think if I had left, I would just be so wrecked with guilt that that would be another thing to cope with.
I was, I can't remember what video this was. If it was, victim to victor. Does that sound like... Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, but anyway, it was on a video, and you were actually were telling us a story when you were being raised by your grandfather. You told us about that you went to either a teacher or an adult at school, and you were letting them know what you were going through. And I think something in regards to they were either reluctant in helping you, or they were trying to talk you out of it. Is that correct, or something like that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, they were. Yep, exactly.
Okay.
They were just nervous about me reporting.
Okay, and I don't want to start. I don't want to focus on this coronavirus, but it leads to this question. I was reading somewhere online to expect an increase in child abuse, and what kids, or what kind of environment are kids at risk in being abused? I mean, is it domestic violence? Is it parental substance abuse? I mean, or mental disorder? What kind of kids are at risk in being abused at their home during this time of the coronavirus? If that all makes sense.
I think that the kids are really being forced to stay at home, and I think for any abusive household, there's explicit abuse that's very obvious, and then there's this just evil kind of abuse that no one knows about in the family. And I think just the nature of being forced to stay at home 24/7 and not have the escape to go to school makes someone vulnerable to that. I wish that abuse was easier to see, that it did maybe discriminate and we'd be able to start solving it from that approach, but it really doesn't discriminate for socioeconomic level. I think it's more obvious in low income areas where the kids are able to get out for school and otherwise are not able to. But I think definitely just the nature of being forced to stay at home and not having that outlet is really challenging.
Right. Over the years, I've been, I think maybe 7 or 8 years, I've been going into public schools and talking about bullying and everything else. And, oftentimes you hear about a child, committing suicide. Matter of fact, this was maybe, I would say maybe 3 years ago. I get a phone call from a school in West Virginia where a 9-year-old boy committed suicide, supposedly because of bullying. I guess my question is this: do you feel? I guess you see it on television, on the news where, kids take their life because they're being bullied. But do you honestly feel that a child would take their life just because of being bullied, or do you think there's other issues like mental illness, or like they might be even going through child abuse, like what we're talking about? Do you feel like there's other things that is making that child to commit suicide?
I think,
or do you think it's just bullying?
I think that bullying can definitely lead to that without having to have a diagnosable mental illness. It's funny because I was having a conversation with Susanna Callahan, who wrote Brain on Fire, and she just released a book called The Great Pretender, which is a historical documentation of how the field of psychiatry came to be. It's really interesting. Something that she brings up is the difference around naming, like mental illness versus mental disorder versus mental challenges. So to answer your question about bullying and its association to mental illness or mental health disorders, I think those can definitely exacerbate it for sure. But I think the isolation and the feeling misunderstood, again, like crosses all those boundaries of the other categorizations. But definitely the lack of support and feeling misunderstood, for sure, I think all of that can lead to suicidality.
So you don't think it could be just one thing? It has to be multiple things.
I think that it can be one thing. I think then there are I think it can be just bullying. I think when you have other elements at play, the social isolation, the lack of family structure, if you do have a mental illness or mental health disorder, that's a part of it, what the family home looks like. I think all of those just contribute to that nature. I remember when I was a kid, I was being bullied in different aspects, but definitely just the abuse at home made me have like suicide ideation. And at the time, I didn't have a diagnosable mental health disorder. Now as an adult, I have like anxiety, and I probably had anxiety as a kid as a
Right.
result of the trauma. But I think to answer your question, that I feel like bullying is so insidious, and I think that's why this podcast and your devotion to talking about this is so vital.
Right. Just to change directions a little bit, one of the things that I guess you've been spending a lot of time on, I think maybe before you got really involved in I'll Be First, maybe not, was you're an advocate against sex trafficking. What sparked your interest, I guess, in getting involved in something like sex trafficking?
When I was a kid, I didn't really know that. I was just very naive, and I didn't realize anything. I didn't know anything about sex at all. But when I went to search for my biological family, I was 19 at the time, and I went to India because I just thought, like, I guess I'm half Indian, so maybe I'll find them. But India's a really big place with 1 billion people, and so I was kind of naive. But it was really eye-opening because I went to volunteer at different shelters and different orphanages, and then did a big medical clinic in a rural area. And when I would talk with people who were running these programs, they would often say that if kids didn't have jobs when they age out of an orphanage, they would have to go towards jobs that are black market. And one of the things that girls would often be pushed into is underage prostitution, unfortunately. And that was just mind-blowing to me. And then also just witnessing a lot of child labor myself. And I think coming back to the States and feeling, I went through a lot of abuse, but I got really lucky in that I had access to education, and then became really passionate about, I can't believe that this is happening. This sort of sex trafficking, child sexual exploitation is happening. I have to do something. And I'm 36 now. So, back then, that wasn't even a topic on the table. I'm so grateful that it's something people talk about now. But I think just really wanting to say, like, okay, I've gotten really lucky, and I'm going to use my privilege to try and help these young girls.
Now, is sex trafficking, because honestly, when I was reading about what you do, I'm thinking, honestly, I have no idea about sex trafficking. I don't know the stats on this. I don't know, if this is an issue in the United States or in the world countries. So is sex trafficking a big issue in the United States, or is there just certain points or major cities throughout the United States that there's sex trafficking?
Child sexual exploitation happens in every state. It happens in every city. It's not obvious. And when we think about child sexual exploitation, we think of the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, capturing girls who have been kidnapped and taken across to Europe. It happens, but often it's more subtle. And again, that's why I think your work with bullying is so important. We talked a little bit about this over email, but not having that consistent family structure and not having a support system means that kids, for example, who are bullied are more vulnerable to someone coming along and saying, I'll take care of you. I'll be your friend. Let me be your boyfriend. And so sex trafficking is just more subtle. Often kids are still in school when it's happening because the people who are pimps or madams or perpetrators don't want it to look like anything's happening. And it happens to girls and boys. So we have instances of child sexual exploitation in every state.
Wow. And so the difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, what's the difference between the two?
Well, unfortunately, sex trafficking and labor trafficking can overlap in a lot of ways, particularly for for women and for children. So women and children can be used for both purposes. Labor trafficking is for work. Just generally speaking, labor trafficking is for work and domestic servitude, so someone who's like a house cleaner, for example, and then sex trafficking is for the use of any sort of sexual act.
Wow. And that's amazing. I don't mean to rush through all this, but what we need to do is probably set up another an interview, a few months down the road. But I want to touch on this. You're like the CEO founder of I'll Be First. Tell us what I'll Be First is, because I'm sure that would be a lot of people, especially during this time, that would take advantage of all this. But tell me about I'll Be First, how you got it started and when and why.
Yeah, so thanks for asking about it. I'll Go First actually came out of my work with sex trafficking victims. I found that a lot of the victims weren't able to, and I should say, let me correct myself, a lot of the survivors weren't able to get access to mental health or trauma recovery care prior to being perpetrated against. So, for example, kids who are in school and they are being abused or they are being bullied, but they don't have access to mental health care, they're just way more vulnerable to being taken advantage of. And something that I found in the field that makes it even more difficult is if someone's not able to articulate their experience around what happened, then often providing social services is really, really difficult. So when I would go to speak in high schools and colleges about sex trafficking and human rights, I often found people would really relate to the story and would approach me afterwards and say, I went through, I was being abused as a kid. I grew up in a house with alcohol, or, they related to something in the story. It didn't have to be, child sexual exploitation. So I would refer them to services that I knew of, but that language is just too scary sometimes. People aren't ready to talk about what's happened. So I created I'll Go First as a way to say, okay, let's start with articulating it. I want to champion you to be in charge of your own healing, for you to go first in your own story. So we provide healing resources for trauma, for addiction services. We partner with organizations who are doing really amazing work, and we support people while they go through behavioral healthcare system. And we do that through providing inspirational content, and then we're working on a suite of digital tools to really put in people's hands to support them while they're going through counseling. Okay, so but you're also it's in the works of, you guys are going to be launching a podcast called I'll Be First, or have you already done that? Yeah, I'm really proud of it. We launched, so it's actually I'll Go First, but we launched I'll Go First in January.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem. We launched I'll Go First in January, and we've had some amazing survivors come on and talk so generously and openly about their experience and what it's looked like for them to heal. And then we've had really cool experts come on as well. We had a hip hop therapist come on, and we just had someone come on and talk about how podcasts can help people stay in treatment. They're doing loads of research at NYU on this. So it's been really neat. We want it to be a tool to help people, to show that there are different paths to healing, and also to really show people who have gone before them and show them how they've gone first, to really inspire them and give them tools in their hands to see how they can go first in their own story.
Wow, that is amazing. Because of the time, what I want to do before I usually end any podcast, there's something that I do. It's called I actually ask you what we call super questions, and you can answer these questions, so short answers or however you want to, and then we can go ahead and wrap things up if that's all right with you.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so the first question. Now this is fun. This could be a fun thing. Well, you know what? Let me do this. Let me back up. I do have one more question, and it's something that I ask a lot of these people that I interview. What do you think the key ingredients are in being successful?
That's such a good question, and I'm so glad you asked that, because I was reflecting on that when we talked over email.
Right.
I remember my acting teacher saying this to me, and it just is clear as day. I can still see him standing in front of me saying this, because I still struggle with self-confidence and self-esteem, and that really comes from being told with my grandfather every day that you're worthless. And man, it is hard to override these messaging that we hear as kids. Sure. So my acting teacher was always trying to encourage me and say that I can do it. And I always went very analytical, diagnostic way, and he always tried to move me away from that. So when I asked him this question, what does it mean to be a success? He very generously moved me away from that diagnostic perspective, and he gave me this story, which is, I think someone who's a success is someone who at the end of the day can look themselves in the mirror and say, you're okay.
Wow. That is awesome. I like that. Well, let's get back to the super questions. The first one is this: what's one word that best describes you?
I hope that it's compassionate.
Definitely. Of everything that you've done, I'd say that's a good answer. What is one of your biggest pet peeves. Now, this can deal with your husband, work, anything.
Oh my gosh, I can't stand when I hear people chew. It drives me nuts.
Now listen, I want to share this with you, and I wouldn't be telling you this if I knew that she was listening to this podcast. My mother-in-law is the best thing. She thinks I'm perfect and everything else, and we have a great relationship. And but every time when the family goes out to eat with her, I have to sit. I cannot sit in front of her. I have to sit beside her, or body from her, if that makes sense, because she would just chew, and it's just so. And then she'll talk, and you see this food coming out of the mouth. I tell you,
I can't do it.
Okay. Okay. Next question. What natural gift would you most like to possess?
Sorry, say that one more time.
What natural gift would you like?
Natural gift
would you like to possess? A lot of people say, music, singing and stuff. Since I took that answer from you, you have to say something else.
I have to say something different?
No.
That's a good question.
What's that?
Gosh, I think maybe to be able to meditate and not get antsy. That's probably a practice, but I think that's a gift given to people that they can sit with themselves and not be anxious about it. I mean, I'm going to go with that one. Maybe it's because of the time in my life, but to be able to sit with yourself. Let
me ask you this. So when you meditate, I just can't see myself doing that. I would like to do it, but
I understand. I completely empathize with that.
Yeah. I just I'm starting to think about things, and then I'm sure there's ways that it keeps your mind, in tune with the meditation, where you're not thinking about, okay, I can't forget this or I can't forget that.
That's exactly what happens to me. And they say it's a practice. And I think coming from the trauma field, I know, I see all the studies that are being done, and that is one of the most powerful things to regulate someone's anxiety and nervous system. And I'm just I can't figure it out.
Now, do you do yoga by any chance?
I mean, I should do yoga.
Okay. Well, we all should do
But you know what? I saw that you do jiu-jitsu, and I took Krav Maga for a year, and I loved it.
Oh, I bet you can do some damage.
I really want to take it again. I was so jealous when I was listening to all the other interviews about people that go to your studio, and I was man, I wish they had that here in New York.
Is your husband athletic, or is he involved in music or anything else? I mean, what's he like?
He's a creative. I think that he's recently gotten involved with running, much to my dismay, because he's a natural runner and he doesn't need any practice. Meanwhile, I've been working for years to try and be fast. But so he started running, and he's pretty athletic these days, and he's a creative. So he's a musician. He can draw. He can do everything. Basically,
oh, really?
It's really annoying.
Okay, last question, Jess. Tell me something true that almost nobody agrees with you on.
Oh my gosh, these are such good questions.
Okay, now let me tell you a good question. If somebody would ask me this question, I would say that I'm a good listener, but my wife would say I'm a horrible listener. But see, I think I'm a good listener, but she wants me to look at her and the TV off and everything else and let me focus, But when I talk with her, I mean, she'll go ahead and watch TV and everything else. And I said, why don't you look at me? She goes, well, I'm hearing you. And then she'll repeat what I say. So I don't see how you guys do it. So anyway, get back to the question.
I think my husband, Chris, thinks I'm very stubborn. And when he listens to this, he's going to be nodding. But I disagree. And I'm very stubborn about not being stubborn.
Okay. Hey, listen, before we go, how can people get in touch with you? Does your website have all these links to your future podcast and everything else? Okay, what's your website? It's
www.illgofirst, so ILLGOFIRST.com. And we actually have an area which I think is so neat that one of our board members suggested, which is a glossary of common language, how we describe, stuff that's going on, sexual violence, depression, all of that. And then we have resources that direct you to those. So that's something we're really proud of. And then we have our podcast up there as well.
Yeah, and I think your videos are awesome. So they need to take advantage of that as well. So what we're going to do is, as soon as this show comes out, We'll go ahead and put a link also so they can go to your website so they don't forget, or in case they don't listen to the whole show. So anyway, well, that's about all we have on the Bully Resistance Show. Before we go, I want to let everyone know again how you can help me fight against bullying by bringing awareness. And how you do that, you can share this show on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Secondly, if you haven't subscribed to the Bully Resistance Show, it doesn't cost you anything. All you have to do is just go to my website at www.davebond.org and click on the banner, and it says subscribe, and all you have to do is just subscribe, and all you'll receive is just notices of the new shows. And then finally, you can be a monthly supporter as low as $4 per month, and depending on your sponsorship, you can receive either Song of the Week or the CD of the Month digital download. And all you have to do is just go to my website at www.davebond.org and click on the Patreon banner. So until next time, thanks for listening.